2:47 in the afternoon. Harbin Air Base occupied Manchuria, Hangar 7, restricted sector. Klaus Becker's hand trembled, not from the Siberian cold seeping through the cracks in the metal hangar, not from the exhaustion of the last 48 hours without sleep, not from the hunger gnawing at his stomach, or the headache pulsing behind his eyes from dehydration and stress. It trembled because, in that exact second, as his fingers made contact with the polished aluminum skin of the fuselage, he understood a truth that no general, no field marshal, no Goebbels speech, no rally at Nuremberg, no promise of wonder weapons had managed to convey. Germany had already lost the war. Not tomorrow, not next month, not in the next Soviet offensive pushing through Poland, not when the Allies crossed the Rhine, not when Berlin fell 2 years ago, maybe 3. Perhaps even before it began. The American bomber rested under military spotlights like a creature from another planet, no, from another dimension entirely. Boeing B-29 Superfortress registration number 426256, barely visible under the wing in crisp black stencil. Captured 3 days earlier after a forced landing in Japanese-controlled territory following engine failure over the Manchurian coast. Intact, almost pristine. Virgin metal gleaming under harsh artificial light. And absolutely, mathematically, devastatingly impossible. Klaus stepped back 2 paces, breath caught in his throat, and felt the weight of his leather-bound notebook slip from his sweaty hands. The notebook filled with technical specifications, measurements he'd planned to take. Questions he'd prepared hit the concrete floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the cavernous hangar like a gunshot. Pages fluttered open, his careful handwriting exposed and suddenly meaningless. No one moved to pick it up. The other 5 German engineers present, Hauptmann Ernst Waldmann, Dr. Heinrich Kessler, Oberst Victor Schreiber, Leutnant Joseph Hartmann, and the grizzled veteran Franz Dietrich remained paralyzed in similar positions around the aircraft, circling that machine like ancient priests discovering a forbidden idol in a temple they thought abandoned. Each man had stopped mid. Waldmann's hand frozen halfway to his mouth, cigarette burning unnoticed between his fingers, Kessler's glasses slipping down his nose, unattended. Schreiber standing at attention without realizing it, military posture automatic even in shock, Hartmann's young face pale, eyes wide. Dietrich, old Dietrich, who'd flown combat missions in the Great War, who'd seen everything, simply staring with an expression Klaus had never seen on the old man's weathered face. Fear not of death, not of the enemy. Fear of obsolescence, of irrelevance, of being rendered primitive by forces beyond comprehension. Waldmann was the first to break the silence. His voice came out hoarse, barely audible, cracking on the second word. Das ist unglitch, impossible. The word hung in the frozen air like a final sentence from a judge, like the reading of a death warrant. Klaus closed his eyes, trying to shut out the reality, trying to return to the moment before he'd touched the aircraft, before he'd known. Felt the nausea rising from his gut, acid burning his throat, his pulse hammered in his temples. Sweat trickled down his spine despite the temperature hovering near 14 degrees Fahrenheit, because it wasn't impossible, it was there, real, solid, functioning, proven, already deployed in combat operations across the Pacific, already dropping thousands of tons of high explosives on Japanese cities, already flying missions that German bombers couldn't even theoretically accomplish. And every square inch of that aircraft represented a technological abyss that Germany would never would not possibly ever be able to cross. Not with the war consuming every gram of aluminum, every liter of fuel, every calorie of food, every brilliant mind bleeding out on the Eastern Front or buried under rubble in Hamburg or worked to death in the underground factories. Not with the factories being bombed every single night by waves of British Lancasters. Not with the Americans joining those raids now. There'll be 17s and B-24s blotting out the sun in 1,000-plane formations. Not with resources exhausted, supply lines collapsing, allies defecting, fronts crumbling. No, Klaus opened his eyes. The B-29 was still there. Would always be there now, burned into his memory like a brand. 99 feet of length stretching before him, 141 feet of wingspan extending beyond the edges of his vision in the confines of the hangar. The fuselage diameter alone, nearly 13 feet, was larger than some entire aircraft Germany produced pressurized cabin. He knew this from the intelligence reports. Crew could operate at 33,000 feet without oxygen masks, without heavy flight suits, in relative comfort, while German crews froze and gasped in unpressurized bombers at half that altitude. Remote-controlled gun turrets operated by analog fire control computers. He could see them now: top turret, bottom turret, tail turret linked by electrical systems more sophisticated than anything in German aircraft. No human gunners exposed in blisters and bubbles. No frostbite, no reduced efficiency from oxygen deprivation. Just machines serving men in comfort. 4 Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone turbo-supercharged engines of 2,200 horsepower each. Klaus's eyes traced the nacelles, the cowlings, the propellers. 8,800 horsepower total. The entire engine arrangement represented metallurgical achievements Germany had been pursuing for years without success. Maximum speed of 357 miles per hour at 33,000 feet altitude, faster than many German fighters could climb to intercept. Faster than the Bf-109 could manage at that altitude. Faster than was supposed to be possible for something weighing 135,000 pounds fully loaded. Operational range of over 3,200 miles. More than 5,000 kilometers. The distance from Berlin to Moscow and back with room to spare. The capability to strike any target in Germany from bases in England or North Africa or Italy or anywhere the Allies chose to position them. Payload capacity 20,000 pounds of bombs, 9,000 kilograms. That was more than most German bombers could carry internally, and this aircraft could carry it to targets the Germans couldn't even reach. And this single specimen before him was just one unit of mass production. Mass production, the words echoed in Klaus's mind like a death knell. The Americans weren't building experimental prototypes in secret underground workshops with teams of elite engineers working on one-of-a-kind machines. They weren't handcrafting unique aircraft for special missions. They were manufacturing these technological monsters by the thousands, in vast industrial assembly lines in Kansas and Georgia and Washington state. With the same systematic efficiency they produced Ford automobiles and Coca-Cola bottles and Hollywood movies. The Boeing plant in Wichita alone was producing hundreds of these aircraft. The Bell plant in Georgia hundreds more. Martin in Omaha too. Industrial capacity beyond imagining. Klaus felt his legs weaken, muscles turning to water. He leaned against the nearest tool cart, gripping the metal edge until his knuckles went white. The cold metal against his palm brought no comfort, no anchor to reality. Only confirmed what he was seeing. They had crossed the world, Berlin to Manchuria. 3 weeks of hellish travel by train through Poland, across the endless Siberian wastes, through landscapes of snow and steppe and desolation, through territories contested and dangerous, through checkpoints and inspections and delays. Then by ship across the Sea of Japan, risking American submarines. Then train again through occupied Manchuria to Harbin. 3 weeks of cramped compartments, stale bread, ersatz coffee, sleepless nights, believing they would evaluate enemy technology to develop countermeasures, to learn, to copy, to adapt, to somehow impossibly catch up, to find weaknesses, to win. But standing here now, Klaus understood the horrifying truth. There was nothing to copy, no weakness to exploit. No secret to steal that would matter, because even if Germany somehow obtained complete blueprints, every single technical drawing, every material specification, every manufacturing process, they couldn't build it. They didn't have the aluminum. They didn't have the advanced alloys. They didn't have the machine tools. They didn't have the electrical components. They didn't have the computing systems. They didn't have the factory capacity. They didn't have the skilled workforce. They didn't have the fuel. They didn't have the time. No way to catch up. No path to victory. No hope. The war was already lost. And he, Klaus Becker, chief engineer at Messerschmitt AG, Peenemünde veteran, member of the secret jet development program, specialist in advanced aerodynamics, holder of 3 patents in wing design, was seeing the physical proof of the impossible made routine. Dr. Kessler took 2 hesitant steps forward, moving like a man in a dream. His hand reached out, trembling, and touched the nose landing gear. The tricycle mechanism nose wheel forward, main gear under the wings represented just another casual humiliation. More efficient for takeoff, safer for landing, better visibility for pilots, more stable on the ground, reduced chance of nose-over accidents, not the conventional tailwheel configuration used by every German bomber, every Japanese bomber, most British bombers. The Americans had simply decided that the old way was insufficient, had engineered a better solution, and implemented it across their entire heavy bomber fleet, as if it were easy. As if the engineering challenges were trivial. How long? Kessler's question emerged as a desperate plea, his voice breaking. Klaus Heinrich, Ernst, how long would it take us to build something like this? 2 years? 3? If we dedicated everything to it, if we pulled resources from the jet program, from the rockets, from everything else? No one answered. The silence stretched. Seconds passed. Someone's breathing rattled harsh in the cold air. The spotlights hummed. Somewhere outside, a truck engine started. Because they all knew the answer. Never. Even saying never would be optimistic. Would imply that given infinite time, it might be possible. But the gap wasn't just technological. It was industrial. It was economic. It was philosophical. The Americans had built an entirely different approach to warfare. Not brilliant individual designs. Not wonder weapons. Not elite units with special equipment. Mass production of excellence. Overwhelming industrial might applied with systematic efficiency. Good enough repeated 10,000 times is better than perfection achieved once. Klaus's heart hammered irregular rhythms against his ribs. Cold sweat soaked through his shirt, his undershirt, his skin. His hands shook. Despite the temperature of 14 degrees Fahrenheit, despite the cold concrete under his feet, despite the Siberian winter pressing against the hangar walls, he felt feverish. He forced his feet to move. One step another, approached the open side hatch in the fuselage, the crew entrance, stared at the opening like it was a portal to another world. Someone had placed a portable ladder. He climbed, metal rungs cold under his palms, each step bringing him closer. He reached the hatch, he entered, and his world collapsed completely. 3.5 years earlier, Technical University of Berlin, autumn 1940. Klaus Becker should never have arrived where he was. The German academic system had precise categories, hierarchies, bloodlines of knowledge passed from professor to worthy student to future professor. The sons of engineers became engineers. The sons of engineers became academics. The sons of industrialists entered industry at appropriate levels. Everyone knew their place. Everyone understood the structure. Klaus Becker was the son of a carpenter from Dusseldorf and a Polish seamstress. He represented everything that the system was designed to exclude. No lineage, no connections, no family money, no letters of recommendation from important men, no membership in the right social clubs, no summer spent at the country estates of future employers, no uncle in the ministry, no brother-in-law at Junkers, no cousin at BMW. Just a mind absurdly, almost supernaturally precise for applied mathematics, and an obsession with aerodynamics that consumed him completely. His mother noticed at first. Klaus at 7 years old, watching birds for hours, sketching their wings with carpenter's pencils stolen from his father's workshop. Klaus at 9, building model gliders from scrapwood, testing different wing angles, keeping meticulous notebooks of which designs flew farthest. Klaus at 12, explaining to her in serious tones how the angle of attack affects lift coefficient and how this relates to stall characteristics. She didn't understand the words, but she understood her son was different. His father saw only impracticality. Learn the trade, boy. Carpentry is honest work, keeps you fed. All this dreaming about flying machines, where does that lead? Do you think BMW will hire a Polish woman's son? But Klaus's mathematics teacher at gymnasium saw something else. Saw a student who solved differential equations intuitively, who grasped complex problems instantly, whose homework contained original proofs. He arranged a scholarship, partial only, enough for tuition, not for room and board. Klaus worked nights at a printing press, slept for hours, attended lectures, studied in libraries until they closed. Existed on black bread and margarine and weak coffee. His professors at the Technical University of Berlin tolerated him with barely concealed disdain. The carpenter's son, they called him in faculty corridors. Some said it to his face. Professor Dietrich Voss, chair of the Aeronautical Engineering Department, introduced him at a seminar as our working-class scholarship case, proof that talent can emerge anywhere, though breeding tells in the end. The other students, sons of proper families, ignored him. He ate lunch alone, studied alone, worked alone. His thesis was brilliant. He knew it was brilliant. 3 years of work on optimization of wing profiles using partial differential equations, original mathematical approaches, novel solutions to boundary layer problems, calculations performed laboriously by hand, filling notebook after notebook. The evaluation committee rejected it. First time too ambitious, lacks proper foundation in established theory, shows insufficient respect for the work of senior researchers. Klaus revised it, included more references, more citations, more acknowledgement of existing work, resubmitted, rejected again. Lacks elegance appropriate for German engineering. That was Professor Voss, who didn't say what he meant. Lacks the aristocratic touch, the subtle polish that comes from being raised in the right world. The third time, Klaus did something that killed him inside. He gutted his thesis, removed all his innovations, all his original thinking, all the insights that made it matter. Transformed it into a safe, boring compilation of accepted theories with minor applications. Made it mediocre deliberately. It passed, grade. Be freed again, satisfactory, the lowest passing grade, no honors, no distinction, no offers from Messerschmitt, Junkers, Heinkel, Focke-Wulf, or any of the major aeronautical firms. He was 24 years old, held a degree in aeronautical engineering from a prestigious university, and could find no engineering work. He went to Essen. Took a job at a mechanical components factory. They made parts for agricultural equipment, gears for tractors, transmission shafts, pulleys, nothing that flew, nothing that mattered. His supervisor was a man named Gerhard who'd worked there 30 years. Good man, fair man, but limited. You're overqualified for this. Boy, why'd you take this job? Because it was offered. Klaus lived in a boarding house, shared a toilet with 6 other men, worked 9 hours a day inspecting gear, teeth. Came home exhausted, ate boiled potatoes, slept repeatedly. He was 24 years old and felt 70. Then September 1939 arrived. Germany invaded Poland. Klaus's mother wrote frantic letters. Her family was in Poznan. He never learned what happened to them. The letters stopped. Then France fell. Then the Battle of Britain began. And suddenly, overnight, catastrophically, Germany needed engineers. Many engineers, all the engineers. The Luftwaffe was expanding faster than anyone had planned. Aircraft production was surging. Messerschmitt AG producing the Bf 109 fighter that was winning the air war needed to triple output. They were hiring anyone with a technical degree. Anyone. Klaus applied, was accepted, started November 1940, in quality control, checking rivets on Bf 109 fuselages. It was humiliating. It was mechanical. It was infinitely below his capabilities. He was inspecting work a trained technician could evaluate. But it was aircraft. It was engineering. It was the industry he'd dreamed of since childhood. Klaus worked 12 hours daily, 6 days a week, sometimes 7 when deadlines pressed. He memorized every technical specification, every tolerance, every material property, every assembly sequence. And he noticed things, patterns of structural failure that repeated, cracks forming in specific locations, rivets failing under particular stress conditions, problems the other inspectors missed or dismissed as random variation. Klaus documented everything, kept his own notebooks, performed calculations in the evenings, identified root causes, developed solutions. One day he approached his supervisor, nervous, deferential. "Herr Brucker, I've noticed a pattern in the wing root failures. I believe I've identified the cause and have a proposed modification." Brucker stared at him. "Your quality control?" "Yes, sir, but I have an engineering degree, and I'm aware you have a degree, Becker. If you were any good, you'd be in design, not checking rivets. Now get back to work." But Brucker mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone else. And eventually, 3 weeks later, a senior engineer named Wilhelm Eckhardt came to inspect a failed wing section. Klaus was working nearby. Eckhardt studied the failure, muttered to himself, made notes. Klaus approached, heart pounding. "Excuse me, Herr Eckhardt, I've documented 17 similar failures. I believe the problem originates from resonance interaction between the wing spar frequency and engine vibration at specific RPM ranges. I've calculated, show me." Klaus showed him 3 notebooks of data, calculations, proposed modifications. Eckhardt read for 30 minutes in silence, then looked up. "You're wasted in quality control. Report to project design on Monday." Klaus Becker, age 25, son of a carpenter, entered real engineering inside the B-29 3:12 p.m. same day. The interior of the bomber was worse than the exterior, infinitely worse, because from outside Klaus could still maintain some psychological distance, could still classify it as just an aircraft, albeit an advanced one, could still pretend that German engineering might somehow respond, adapt, overcome. Inside, that illusion shattered completely. The first thing that struck him was the space. The pressurized crew compartments were spacious enough for men to move freely, even at combat altitude. The forward section contained positions for pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, bombardier, and navigator, connected by a crawl tunnel over the bomb bays to the rear compartment housing the gunners, all pressurized, all climate controlled. German bomber crews froze at altitude, wore heated suits that frequently malfunctioned, breathed through oxygen masks that caused frostbite on skin, operated equipment with thick gloves that made precision impossible, lost effectiveness after hours in sub-zero temperatures at thin atmosphere. American crews flew in, shirt sleeves. Klaus ran his hand along the fuselage interior. The aluminum skin was smooth, precisely joined, showing manufacturing quality that required industrial processes Germany couldn't replicate at scale. Each rivet was perfect. Each rivet was perfect. Each seam was exact. This wasn't handcrafted precision by master technicians. This was mass production achieving what Germany could barely accomplish in prototypes. Dr. Kessler had climbed in behind him. The older engineer's breathing was labored, almost panicked. He touched the pilot's seat, padded, adjustable, ergonomically designed, and made a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. They even made it comfortable. "Look at this, Klaus. Look at the instruments." The cockpit instrument panel was a revelation. Not the cramped, chaotic arrangement of German bombers where critical gauges competed for space and attention. This was systematically organized, clearly labeled, logically grouped, every control where the pilot could reach it naturally, every indicator positioned for optimal visibility. Human factors, engineering. The Americans had considered not just whether something could work, but whether exhausted, terrified, freezing men could operate it effectively under combat stress. Hartmann squeezed into the compartment, followed by Waldmann and Schreiber. 5 German engineers crowding into the cockpit like tourists in a museum, like primitive tribesmen examining a radio. The humiliation was visceral. Waldmann found the electrical panel, opened it, stared. Main got the wiring was color-coded, standardized, organized with printed labels and systematic routing. German aircraft wiring was functional but chaotic, each technician running cables by individual judgment, creating maintenance nightmares where tracing a single wire could take hours. This was designed for mass production and field maintenance. Designed so any trained technician could understand the system immediately. Designed for an industrial war where aircraft were expendable and crews were not. "The fire control system," Schreiber said, pointing to a control box. "This operates the gun turrets remotely. The gunners don't manually aim. They use computing sites that calculate lead automatically. Analog computers." In a production aircraft, Klaus felt dizzy. Germany had been experimenting with remote-controlled turrets. Prototypes existed. None worked reliably. The engineering challenges were immense, synchronizing turret movement with sighting systems, calculating ballistic trajectories in real time, integrating everything electrically. The Americans had solved it, made it standard equipment. built thousands of aircraft with systems Germany couldn't make work in one. "Look at the bomb bay," Kessler called from deeper in the aircraft. They crawled through the tunnel. That was impressive. A pressurized tube connecting crew compartments and emerged at the bomb bay viewing station. Two enormous bomb bays capable of holding 20,000 pounds of ordnance. The structural engineering required to create that internal volume while maintaining airframe strength was staggering. German bombers achieved their payload capacity through external racks or cramped internal bays that compromised aerodynamics. This was elegant, efficient. The bomb bay doors were engineered to open quickly, release payload and close in seconds, minimizing drag and exposure time over targets. Every single aspect reflected systematic thinking. Not brilliant individual solutions, but comprehensive system integration where each component supported the others. Franz Dietrich, the oldest of the engineers, had been silent since entering the aircraft. He sat now in the radio operator's position, hands resting on the equipment, eyes distant. "I flew bombers in 1918, he said quietly. "Gotha GIV, we thought we were advanced strategic bombing, raiding London, the future of warfare." He laughed bitterly. That was 26 years ago. This aircraft represents more advancement than occurred in the previous 50 years of aviation, and they're building them by the thousands. How Hartmann's voice cracked. He was youngest, only 23, fresh from university. "How did they achieve this? We have brilliant engineers. We have the jet fighter. We have rockets. We have nothing," Dietrich interrupted. "That's what this aircraft is telling us. All our wonder weapons, our secret projects, our advanced designs, they're irrelevant. Because we're developing machines individually, in small numbers, by elite teams. The Americans are industrializing advancement itself." Klaus understood what Dietrich meant. The B-29 wasn't just a bomber. It was proof of concept for an entirely different approach to warfare. Germany's strategy relied on technological superiority through individual brilliance, develop the best tank, the best fighter, the best scientists working on the best weapons, quality over quantity. America's approach was systematic industrialization, designed for mass production from the start. Create good enough technology that could be manufactured in overwhelming numbers, train adequate personnel in huge quantities, apply industrial efficiency to warfare itself. And the terrifying reality was that America's good enough had surpassed Germany's best somewhere along the way. The Me-262 jet fighter was faster than anything the Allies had, but Germany could build perhaps dozens per month, using rare materials. With engines that lasted 25 hours before failure, America was building thousands of B-29s per year with engines that ran for hundreds of hours, using production methods that didn't require rare materials or elite craftsmen. Quality versus quantity was false dichotomy. America had achieved quality at quantity. Klaus moved to the tail section. The tailgunner's position was pressurized, connected to the rest of the aircraft, with excellent visibility and sophisticated targeting systems. Even the gunner, traditionally the most exposed, most vulnerable crew position, had protection and advanced equipment. He found technical manuals stored in a compartment, pulled one out. It was printed mass-produced documentation, hundreds of pages clearly illustrated, maintenance procedures, system specifications, troubleshooting guides. German aircraft often had incomplete documentation. Technical knowledge existed in the heads of engineers and experienced mechanics. Repairs required expertise and judgment. The Americans had systematized even knowledge transfer. A mechanic with a manual could maintain this complex aircraft anywhere in the world. Waldman was examining the supercharger systems on the engines through an access panel. "These turbochargers are more advanced than anything we've achieved. They allow sustained operations at altitudes where our fighters struggle to intercept. And the fuel consumption, Klaus, they must have solved the mixture ratio problems we've been fighting for years." "They've solved everything," Schreiber said flatly. "That's the point. Every technical challenge we're struggling with, they've solved. Pressurization, high-altitude engines, long-range navigation, remote weapon systems, all of it, and integrated into a production aircraft." The 5 men sat in silence, surrounded by American engineering excellence, each grappling with the implications. Klaus forced himself to think clearly, to analyze, to understand not just what he was seeing, but why it existed. The B-29 program must have cost billions. The development time must have been years. The industrial capacity required to produce them at scale represented an economy operating at levels Germany couldn't match. And America was doing this while also producing fighters, attack aircraft, transport planes, trainers, while building the world's largest navy, while supplying Britain and the Soviet Union with equipment through Lend-Lease, while maintaining civilian economy. The raw industrial and economic power was incomprehensible. Germany was scraping together resources for every aircraft produced, rationing aluminum, substituting inferior materials, pulling skilled workers from factories for military service, operating on the edge of collapse. America was operating with surplus capacity. "We need to document everything," Klaus said, forcing professional detachment. "That's our mission. Measure, photograph, record. Berlin needs complete intelligence. For what purpose? Dietrich asked. So they can understand how badly we've lost. So they can calculate the precise magnitude of our defeat. So they can make informed decisions, Klaus replied, not believing his own words. What decisions remained? Fight to the bitter end with inferior equipment. Negotiate from weakness, surrender. None of those required precise specifications of American bomber technology, but he was an engineer. Documentation was what engineers did, so he would document, would measure, would record, would perform his function because function was all that remained when meaning evaporated. 4:47 p.m. Japanese officers' quarters, Harbin Air Base. Klaus sat across from Hauptmann Waldmann and Dr. Kessler in a sparse military office that smelled of cigarette smoke and desperation. 3 hours of detailed examination had produced notebooks full of measurements, dozens of photographs with the bulky reconnaissance camera they'd brought from Berlin, and absolutely no hope. A Japanese Colonel Nakamura, his name was, had joined them. Through a translator, he'd been asking the same question repeatedly for 20 minutes. Can the aircraft be replicated? Can we manufacture copies? Waldman had been deflecting. The technical specifications require analysis. We need to return to Berlin with our documentation. The complexity is substantial. But is it possible? Nakamura pressed. Kessler removed his glasses, cleaned them, slowly, a stalling tactic, Klaus recognized. Colonel, the aircraft represents integration of multiple advanced systems. Each individual system presents significant challenges. The combination is yes or no. Can it be copied? Silence. Klaus felt everyone's eyes turn to him. He was technical lead. The question was his to answer. He could lie, say perhaps with sufficient resources and time, give Berlin and Tokyo what they wanted to hear. Maintain the fiction that the war was still winnable, that enough determination and sacrifice could overcome the technological gap, or he could speak truth. No, Klaus said clearly, it cannot be replicated. Not by Germany, not by Japan, not in any time frame relevant to this war. The translator hesitated, as if uncertain he'd understood correctly. Nakamura's expression darkened. Waldman shot Klaus a warning look. Klaus continued, the aircraft requires industrial capacity we don't possess. Aluminum alloys we cannot produce in sufficient quantity. Electronics manufacturing we haven't mastered. Precision machine tools we lack. And even if we solved every technical challenge, which would take years, we don't have the fuel to operate such aircraft in meaningful numbers. You're being defeatist, Waldman said sharply. I'm being accurate, Klaus replied. We were sent to evaluate whether this aircraft represents technology we can counter. The answer is no. Reporting otherwise would be lying to ourselves. Nakamura stood abruptly, said something harsh in Japanese, and left the room. The translator remained. The colonel is displeased. He had hoped for more positive assessment. Reality rarely cares about our hopes, Dietrich muttered. After the translator departed, Waldman turned on Klaus. What were you thinking? We need to maintain morale. Give them something to work with. False hope, Klaus asked. You've been inside that aircraft. You've seen what we're facing. How does lying help? It buys time. For what? Time to lose more completely. Time to sacrifice more lives on a lost cause. The room fell silent. Because Klaus had said what they all knew but couldn't acknowledge. Schreiber spoke carefully. There could be consequences. For all of us, defeatism is not tolerated. Then I'll be defeatist alone, Klaus said. But I won't lie in my report. If Berlin wants comfortable fictions, they can find someone else. Hartmann had been silent, but now spoke hesitantly. What if... What if there's something we're missing? Some vulnerability. Every weapon has weaknesses. The aircraft must have limitations. Klaus considered. Certainly, it's expensive, complex. Requires trained crews and extensive maintenance. Vulnerable to fighter attack if caught at lower altitudes. The engines are prone to overheating. We saw evidence of that in the cowling modifications on this particular aircraft. So there are weaknesses, Hartmann said, grasping at hope. Irrelevant weaknesses, Klaus replied. Yes, German fighters can shoot it down if they can reach its operating altitude. If they can catch it. If they're not overwhelmed by escort fighters. If the pilots aren't exhausted from previous missions. If the aircraft have fuel. If the runways aren't bombed. If you're saying we should give up, Waldman said quietly. I'm saying we already lost. The B-29 isn't why we lost. It's proof we've been losing for years without realizing it. This aircraft exists because America has the industrial base, the resources, the economy, the population to develop and build it. We never had those things. We were operating on brilliance and determination and belief in superiority, and it was never enough. Kessler stood, moved to the window. Outside, the captured B-29 sat in its hangar, visible through the open doors, spotlights making it gleam. I have 3 sons, Kessler said softly. Friedrich is 17, will be conscripted next year. Heinrich is 15, Otto is 13. He turned back to the room. If the war continues until they're old enough, all 3 will be sent to die. For what? So we can pretend a few months longer that we haven't already lost. That's not our decision to make, Waldman said, isn't it? Kessler challenged. We're the ones with the information. With the proof. If we report honestly what we've seen, what it means, perhaps someone in Berlin will have the courage to accept reality, or will be shot for defeatism, Schreiber said. Possibly, Klaus agreed. But I didn't become an engineer to lie. I solve problems, and sometimes the solution is accepting that a problem can't be solved. That continuing to throw resources at it only wastes those resources. Dietrich had been sitting quietly, ancient eyes, studying Klaus. You remind me of someone I knew in the last war. Spoke truth to generals. They didn't like it then either. He paused. He was right. They were wrong. Millions died because pride prevented accepting reality. So what do we do? Hartmann asked. Klaus pulled his documentation notebook from his bag, opened to a blank page, began writing. We write an honest report, complete technical specifications, accurate assessment of capabilities, and clear analysis of what it means strategically. He looked up. I can't force any of you to sign it, but I'm submitting it regardless. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Kessler sat down, pulled out his own notebook. I'll write this section on propulsion systems. Accurate assessment. Dietrich nodded. Airframe and structural analysis. Factual. Hartmann hesitated, then joined them. Electrical systems and fire control. Schreiber sighed. Operational capabilities and strategic implications. Only Waldman remained standing. You'll realize this could be seen as treason. Or patriotism, Klaus replied. Depends whether you think Germany is best served by comfortable lies or uncomfortable truths. Waldman was silent for 30 seconds, then sat. Aerodynamics and performance characteristics. Objective analysis. They worked through the night. 6 German engineers in occupied Manchuria, documenting the proof of their nation's defeat with scientific precision. Klaus wrote the conclusion section at 4:30 a.m., hand cramping from hours of technical writing. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress represents not merely an advanced aircraft, but a fundamental shift in the character of modern warfare. It embodies industrial capacity, systematic engineering integration, and economic resources at scales beyond Axis capabilities. No amount of tactical brilliance, individual technological advancement, or operational innovation can overcome the strategic disparity it represents. Recommendation: Command must understand that continued prosecution of the war under current circumstances will result in progressive, inevitable, and total defeat. The question is not whether this outcome can be avoided, but only how many additional lives will be sacrificed before it is acknowledged. He read it aloud, waited for objections. None came. As dawn broke over Manchuria, they had 173 pages of technical documentation and honest analysis. It would be sent to Berlin through military channels. It would be read by someone, maybe dismissed, maybe taken seriously, maybe used as evidence for court-martial. Klaus didn't know, didn't care anymore. He'd done what engineers do, examined a problem, analyzed the data, and reported findings. The truth was the truth, whether anyone wanted to hear it or not. And the truth was, Germany had lost the war the moment America decided to win it. October 12, 1944, 11:23 a.m. Reichsluftfahrtdienst, Reich Aviation Ministry, Berlin. The report arrived in Berlin 6 weeks after Klaus and his team left Manchuria. 6 weeks of travel back through war-torn geography. 6 weeks during which the Eastern Front collapsed further. 6 weeks in which American and British bombers continued their systematic destruction of German industrial capacity. 6 weeks in which the inevitable became more inevitable. The document 173 pages of technical analysis, measurements, photographs, and conclusions landed on the desk of General Oberst Hans-Jürgen Stumpf, commander of Luftwaffe Reich, responsible for the air defense of Germany itself. Klaus wasn't present for what happened next. He learned about it later, piecing together accounts from various sources. But the moment the report was read became the moment everything changed, not for the war's outcome, which was already determined, but for how that outcome would be understood. Stumpf read the technical sections first. The specifications, the capabilities, the analysis of systems. His face remained neutral, professional. These were facts, uncomfortable facts, but facts nonetheless. Then he reached Klaus's conclusion section. He read it once, sat back, read it again, called for his adjutant. Get me Generalfeldmarschall Milk. Immediately. Erhard Milk, Inspector General of the Luftwaffe, arrived within the hour. Stumpf handed him the report without comment. Milk read standing up. His face, already deeply lined from years of impossible pressures, aged visibly as he progressed through the pages. When he finished Klaus's conclusion, he set the report down carefully, as if it might explode. Who wrote this? Milk asked quietly. Chief Engineer Klaus Becker Messerschmitt. Previously worked at Peenemünde, excellent credentials. The other 5 engineers co-signed the conclusions. They're saying we've lost. They're saying we lost years ago, Stumpf corrected. The B-29 is merely proof. Milk moved to the window. Outside, Berlin continued its daily functions, people moving through streets, pretending normalcy despite the rubble from recent bombing raids visible in every direction. If this assessment is accurate, it is. Stumpf interrupted. I've had 3 separate teams verify the technical specifications independently. Everything checks. The aircraft capabilities are as stated. And the strategic implications, double quotes, he trailed off, cannot be spoken aloud without risking execution for defeatism. Milk finished. They stood in silence. Two men who'd dedicated their lives to German aviation, to building the Luftwaffe into the world's most formidable air force, confronting the reality that it had been surpassed so completely that no amount of effort could close the gap. What do we do with this? Milk asked. That depends. Do we want to survive the next 6 months, or do we want to tell the truth? Milk turned from the window. Can we do both? I don't know. The report was classified top secret. Copies were made exactly 7. One for Reichsmarschall Gring, commander of the Luftwaffe, one for Albert Speer, minister of armaments, one for the Wehrmacht High Command, one for each of the 3 Luftflotte commanders, one retained in the Aviation Ministry archives. The reaction to each copy told its own story. Gring's office. October 15th, Reichsmarschall Hermann Gring read the report in his luxurious office at Carenhall, surrounded by looted art and delusions of continued relevance. He was 2 hours into reading when he began shouting, "Defeatist propaganda! These engineers are cowards, traitors." His aide stood nervously by the door. "Herr Reichsmarschall, the technical specifications have been verified." "I don't care about specifications. The quality of German engineering is superior. Always has been, always will be. These numbers mean nothing against German will and determination." He called for the file on Klaus Becker. Wanted the engineer arrested immediately for defeatism. His staff tactfully reminded him that Becker was currently at Messerschmitt working on modifications to the Me-262 jet fighter, one of the few projects still producing results. Gring ordered the report destroyed, declared it would not be circulated further, demanded a new assessment showing how German technology would overcome the American bomber threat. His staff nodded, agreed, did nothing. Because they knew what Gring would not accept. The report was accurate, and pretending otherwise wouldn't change reality. Speer's office, October 16th. Albert Speer read the report alone in his office at midnight. When he finished, he sat motionless for 20 minutes. Then he pulled out production figures for German aircraft manufacturing, compared them to intelligence estimates of American production, did calculations that he'd been avoiding for months. The numbers were devastating. In 1944, Germany would produce approximately 40,000 aircraft of all types, an impressive number achieved through extraordinary efforts, brutal efficiency, and the sacrifice of almost everything else. America would produce over 96,000 aircraft the same year, while also building the world's largest navy, while supplying allies, while maintaining civilian economy, and the American aircraft were, on average, more advanced than German equivalents. Speer drafted a memo to Hitler and outlined the industrial disparity, suggested that negotiated settlement might preserve Germany as a nation, while continued fighting would result in complete destruction. He never sent it, because he knew it would be dismissed, knew he might be arrested, knew that truth was now treason. Instead, he filed the report carefully and continued organizing the production of weapons for a war that was already lost. Wehrmacht High Command. October 18th. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, Chief of Wehrmacht Operations Staff, read the report with professional detachment. He'd been receiving similar assessments, less detailed, more carefully worded, for months. The B-29 report was simply the most explicit statement of what every honest analyst already knew. He showed it to General Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, who read it and immediately began crafting arguments for why it was wrong, not because he believed those arguments, but because belief was no longer relevant. Only loyalty mattered, only following orders, only continuing the function regardless of outcome. "Should we brief the Führer?" Keitel asked. Jodl considered. What purpose would it serve? He should know the situation. He knows the situation. He chooses to believe different interpretations. Showing him this report won't change his mind. It will only make him angry, and possibly result in 6 talented engineers being shot. They filed the report without further action. Back at Messerschmitt, November 3, 1944, Klaus returned to work at Messerschmitt expecting arrest, or transfer to a punishment battalion, or simply disappearance in the night. Instead, nothing happened. His report had vanished into the bureaucratic void. No acknowledgement, no response, no consequences. He continued work on the Me-262 jet fighter. The aircraft was brilliant, genuinely superior to anything the Allies had. Capable of 540 miles per hour, far faster than any propeller fighter, armed with 30mm cannons that could destroy bombers with short bursts. But production was slow. Perhaps 300 would be completed by year's end, and they required specialized fuel, rare materials, experienced pilots, and bases with runways long enough for their landing speed. The Allies were fielding thousands of aircraft monthly. Brilliance versus mass production. Germany was losing. One afternoon in November, Klaus was called to a meeting with Willy Messerschmitt himself. The legendary aircraft designer, the man whose fighters had dominated the early war, wanted to discuss the B-29 report. They met in Messerschmitt's private office. "Just the two of them." "I read your assessment," Messerschmitt said without preamble, "through unofficial channels. It was suppressed officially, but copies exist." Klaus waited, uncertain if this was prelude to punishment. You were correct, Messerschmitt continued. I've known we were losing the industrial war for 2 years, but no one wanted to hear it. They wanted wonder weapons, secret projects, technological miracles, as if enough genius could overcome industrial capacity. I just reported what I saw, Klaus said. You reported what everyone needed to hear, but no one wanted to acknowledge. That takes courage or stupidity, possibly both. Messerschmitt stood, moved to a wall safe, removed a folder. This is preliminary analysis of an aircraft concept. Jet bomber, long range, high speed, could potentially match B-29 capabilities. He handed the folder to Klaus. I want you to evaluate whether it's feasible, and I want honest assessment. Not what I want to hear, what's actually possible. Klaus reviewed the designs over the following week, ran calculations, analyzed feasibility. His conclusion: technically possible, practically impossible. Would require 3 years of development, materials Germany didn't have, and manufacturing capacity that didn't exist. He wrote a 10-page analysis explaining why. Messerschmitt read it, nodded, and filed it away. Thank you for your honesty. It doesn't help, does it? Klaus asked. The truth, it changes nothing. It changes everything, Messerschmitt replied. Just not in time. Washington, D.C., December 1944. American intelligence received information about the German inspection of the captured B-29 through multiple channels. Soviet sources, British intercepts, resistance networks. The details were fragmentary, but the core facts were clear. German engineers had examined the aircraft thoroughly and transmitted detailed reports to Berlin. At the Pentagon, analysts assessed the implications. Should we be concerned they've obtained technical specifications? A junior officer asked. General Henry Hope Arnold, commanding general of the U.S. Army Air Forces, considered the question. Concerned that they know the specifications? No. Concerned that they might copy it? No. They lack the industrial capacity. Concerned that they now understand how far behind they've fallen. He paused. That actually serves our purposes. The strategic thinking was simple. The more clearly Germany understood the impossibility of victory, the sooner they might surrender. Every intelligence report showing German awareness of Allied superiority potentially saved lives by hastening the end. Continue B-29 operations as planned, Arnold ordered. Increase bombing of Japanese industrial targets. Let them see what the aircraft can do. Sometimes the best psychological warfare is demonstrating capabilities so overwhelming that resistance becomes obviously futile. Tokyo, January 1945. The Japanese military had also inspected the captured B-29. Their conclusions were similar to the Germans. The aircraft represented industrial and technological capacity Japan could not match, but their response was different. Germany, facing defeat on multiple fronts, still retained some capacity for rational strategic assessment. Some officers, some officials, could acknowledge at least privately that the war was lost. Japan's military culture made such acknowledgement nearly impossible. Surrender was dishonor. Defeat was unthinkable. Therefore, the war would continue regardless of material circumstances. The B-29 reports were filed, noted, and then ignored in favor of planning. Desperate defensive measures and suicide attacks. The aircraft that had shown German engineers the futility of continued resistance showed Japanese military planners only the necessity of more fanatical determination. Same evidence, different interpretations, different outcomes. Moscow, February 1945. Soviet intelligence obtained copies of both the German and Japanese assessments of the B-29. Stalin read them with interest. The Soviet Union was America's ally, but Stalin was already thinking about the post-war world, about spheres of influence, about balance of power. The B-29 represented American capability to strike any target on Earth, including Soviet targets. The aircraft had the range to reach Moscow from bases in Europe or Asia, could carry enough explosives to destroy entire cities. And America had hundreds of them, soon thousands. Stalin increased priority on Soviet atomic bomb development, intensified espionage against American nuclear programs, began planning for future conflict even while current war continued. The B-29 had shown Germany the futility of fighting America. It showed the Soviet Union the necessity of eventually matching American power. Different perspectives, different conclusions. Same transformative technology. Harbin Air Base, March 1945. The captured B-29 that Klaus and his team had inspected sat in its hangar for months. Soviet forces were advancing through Manchuria. Japanese control of the region was collapsing. In March, orders came to destroy the aircraft, prevent it from falling into Soviet hands intact. Japanese engineers stripped useful components first. Instruments, radio equipment, pieces of the engines, anything that might provide continued intelligence value. Then they doused the airframe in fuel and burned it. The aluminum structure melted and warped in the intense heat. The pressurized compartments collapsed. The sophisticated systems that had amazed and devastated Klaus Becker were reduced to twisted, unrecognizable wreckage. It took 4 hours for the fire to consume the aircraft completely. The Japanese colonel who ordered the destruction watched the fire with unreadable expression. Through a translator, he said simply, "Now no one can learn from it." But the lesson had already been learned. Klaus's report had documented everything. The photographs existed. The measurements were recorded. The analysis was complete. Burning one aircraft couldn't unring that bell. The truth was out. The disparity was acknowledged. The implications were understood by those willing to see them. Berlin, April 1945. Soviet forces entered Berlin. The city was being destroyed street by street. The Reich was collapsing. Everything was ending. Klaus Becker was not in Berlin. He'd been evacuated to a facility in Bavaria, still working on jet fighter modifications that no longer mattered. But his report remained in the Aviation Ministry archives. When Soviet soldiers captured the ministry building, they found filing cabinets full of documents, technical specifications, project files, intelligence reports, including 7 copies of Klaus's B-29 assessment. The Soviets translated them immediately, sent copies to their own aviation designers, to Tupolev, to Luftwaffe, to Stalin's military advisors. The report became foundational document for Soviet post-war aviation strategy. Every point Klaus had made about American industrial and technological capacity informed Soviet planning for the next decade. The bomber they eventually developed, the Tupolev Tu-4, was nearly exact copy of the B-29, reverse-engineered from 3 aircraft that made emergency landings in Soviet territory. Klaus's assessment had predicted that neither Germany nor Japan could replicate the B-29. He'd been correct. But he hadn't predicted that the Soviet Union, with its vast resources and post-war focus, would succeed where the Axis failed. History was complex that way. Truth was true, but truth's implications unfolded in unpredictable directions. Messerschmitt Facility, Bavaria. May 7, 1945. Klaus heard about German surrender on the radio. May 7, 1945. Unconditional surrender to Allied forces. The war in Europe was over. He sat alone in his small office, surrounded by technical drawings that no longer had purpose, jet fighters that would never be completed, modifications that would never be implemented, problems that no longer needed solving. He thought about the B-29, about that afternoon in Manchuria 8 months earlier when he'd touched the aircraft and understood. Had his report mattered? Had telling the truth changed anything? Probably not. The war would have ended the same way regardless. The forces in motion were too massive for one engineer's assessment to alter. But perhaps somewhere in the bureaucratic chaos, someone had read his words and understood slightly earlier. Perhaps some general had made some decision that saved some lives. Perhaps some official had advocated for some action that hastened the end by some small increment. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the report had simply vanished into the void, read and dismissed and forgotten. Klaus would never know. What he did know was this: he'd been asked to evaluate enemy technology and provide honest assessment. He'd done so. He'd told the truth when lies would have been easier, safer, more comfortable. And whether it mattered or not, whether anyone listened or not, whether anything changed or not, he'd fulfilled his function as an engineer: to examine problems honestly, to calculate accurately, to report findings truthfully. The rest was beyond his control. American forces arrived at the facility 3 days later. Klaus and his colleagues were detained, interviewed, their work examined. The Americans were particularly interested in the jet fighter technology. During his interrogation, Klaus mentioned the B-29 inspection. The American intelligence officer's eyes sharpened with interest. "You examined the captured aircraft in Manchuria?" "Yes, last July. 6 of us spent 2 days performing complete technical evaluation." "What was your conclusion?" Klaus met his eyes. That Germany had already lost the war, that the aircraft represented industrial and technological capacity we could never match, that continued fighting was futile. The American officer studied him for a long moment. "Did you report that to your superiors?" "Yes, in writing. 173 pages. Complete analysis." "And what happened?" Klaus shrugged. "Nothing. The report was classified and suppressed. I continued my regular work. The war continued until industrial capacity and military force resolved it, as the report predicted." The officer made notes. "You understand that many German engineers will be taken to America to work on our aerospace programs. Operation Paperclip. Your expertise would be valuable." Klaus considered. "Why would you want me? I'm the engineer who told his superiors they'd lost. Not particularly loyal." "You're the engineer who examined evidence, drew accurate conclusions, and reported honestly despite consequences. That's exactly the kind of mind we need." 6 months later, Klaus Becker was in Wright Field, Ohio, examining American jet fighter prototypes, contributing to designs that would dominate the skies for the next generation. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd recognized American superiority in time to understand defeat. Now he'd help maintain that superiority into the future. History was strange that way. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio, July 1964. Klaus Becker was 68 years old when he returned to the moment that changed everything. Not physically, the B-29 in Manchuria was long gone, melted to slag in 1945. But memory has geography of its own, and on this particular July afternoon, Klaus found himself walking through that Harbin hangar once again. He was attending a symposium on aerospace engineering history. Retired now from active design work, he'd spent 19 years contributing to American aircraft development, the F-86 Sabre, the F-100 Super Sabre, early work on what would become the F-4 Phantom. Good aircraft, important aircraft, but none that carried the weight of that single afternoon in Manchuria. The symposium organizers had asked him to speak about pivotal moments in aviation history. They expected him to discuss jet fighter development, perhaps the transition to supersonic flight, maybe early missile technology. Instead, Klaus told them about touching the B-29. The lecture hall held perhaps 200 people, engineers mostly, some military officers, a handful of historians, all waiting politely for a retired German-turned-American engineer to share technical anecdotes. Klaus stood at the podium, notes prepared but suddenly irrelevant. He spoke without them. In July 1944, I touched an aircraft and understood that my country had lost a war that wouldn't officially end for another 10 months. Not believed, not suspected, understood. With the certainty of mathematical proof, that moment has defined every day of the last 20 years. The room went quiet. This wasn't the speech they'd expected. Klaus continued. I've spent 2 decades working for the nation that built that aircraft, contributing to its aerospace superiority. Some people who knew my background asked why. Why work for the enemy? How could I betray Germany? He paused, looking out at the faces watching him. I didn't betray Germany. Germany betrayed itself by choosing a path that made the B-29 inevitable, by starting a war it couldn't win, by believing that will and determination could overcome industrial reality. The B-29 didn't defeat Germany. Germany's choices defeated Germany. The B-29 just made those choices visible. An older man in the front row, American, military bearing, probably Air Force, raised his hand. Klaus nodded. You wrote a report. In 1944, after inspecting the captured aircraft, intelligence files mention it. What happened to that report? Klaus smiled sadly. It was classified, suppressed, ignored, and ultimately proven correct by events. The perfect fate for inconvenient truth. Did it change anything? The officer asked. No, Klaus replied. And yes, it didn't change the war's outcome. That was determined by industrial capacity, resources, and military force. But it changed me. It forced me to confront the difference between expertise and wisdom. I was expert enough to understand what I was seeing. Whether I was wise enough to act on that understanding, that's a question I still can't answer. A younger engineer spoke up. If you could go back, if you could speak to yourself in that hangar, what would you say? Klaus considered. 20 years of reflection condensed to one moment of advice to his younger self. I would say, you are about to touch metal and understand mortality. Not your own death, that's easy to contemplate, but the mortality of nations, of ideologies, of certainties you've built your life around. That understanding will be the loneliest burden you ever carry, and you must carry it anyway, because someone must witness truth, even when no one wants to hear it. The room remained silent. Klaus continued, his voice softer now. The other 5 engineers who examined that aircraft with me stayed in contact with some of them after the war. Ernst Waldman died in 1947. Cirrhosis, he spent the last 2 years of his life drinking to forget what he'd seen. Dr. Heinrich Kessler survived, emigrated to Argentina, opened a small machine shop, refused to ever discuss aviation again. Said he'd spent enough of his life building machines of war. Victor Schreiber was tried at Nuremberg not as major war criminal, but his testimony was taken. He confirmed every detail of our report. Spent the rest of his life in obscurity. Joseph Hartman Young, Joseph who'd asked if we were missing something, if there might be weakness we hadn't seen. He became a school teacher, physics, in a small town in Switzerland. Never touched an aircraft again. And Franz Dietrich, old Dietrich who'd flown in the First War and recognized immediately what the B-29 meant. He died in 1953. Before he died, he wrote me a letter. I still have it, he said. We witnessed the moment when warfare outgrew human scale, when killing became industrial process too efficient to prevent, too terrible to survive unchanged. The B-29 was proof that humanity had engineered its way past the point where individual courage or brilliance mattered. Only systems matter now. Only capacity. We saw it first. That's our curse and our distinction. Klaus pulled the letter from his jacket pocket. Worn from repeated reading, creased and fragile. He was right. We witnessed a transition point. Not just in military technology, but in human capability to organize destruction. The B-29 was remarkable not because it was one brilliant design, but because it proved that brilliance could be systematized, replicated, mass-produced, that excellence could be industrial process. A historian in the third row spoke. Do you think your report saved any lives? Even indirectly. The question Klaus had been asking himself for 20 years. I don't know, he answered honestly. The war continued 9 more months after we submitted that report. Millions more died. Perhaps if someone had listened, had taken action based on our assessment, some small number of those deaths might have been prevented, or perhaps not. Perhaps the momentum of war is too great for truth to deflect. But I've concluded that's the wrong question. The right question isn't whether truth changes outcomes. It's whether we maintain the courage to speak truth regardless of outcome. Because the moment we stop speaking truth because it might not matter, that's the moment we've truly lost everything. Wright Field Officers Club, evening, same day. After the symposium, a small group gathered for informal discussion. Klaus found himself at a corner table with 3 other engineers and a historian from the Smithsonian. The historian, Dr. Sarah Chen, young and sharp, asked the question Klaus had been avoiding all day. Herr Becker, you've spoken about the technical aspects, the strategic implications, the historical significance. But what did it feel like? That moment when you touched the aircraft and understood. Klaus stared into his whiskey. Water of life, the Scots called it. A strange name for something that deadened feeling. Imagine you're a priest, he said slowly. You've dedicated your life to faith, to certainty, to belief in divine order. Then one day you open a forbidden text and find mathematical proof that God doesn't exist. Rigorous proof, undeniable, and you understand that everything you've built your identity on is foundation built on nothing. That's what it felt like. Not political, not ideological, existential. I was an engineer. Engineering was my faith. German engineering was supposedly the world's best. That belief survived every setback, every defeat, every compromise. And then I touched that aircraft and really understood that we'd been surpassed so completely that the gap would never close. It wasn't even close. That was the devastating part. If the B-29 had been slightly better than German bombers, that would be survivable, competitive, but it was generations ahead. And it was the Americans had achieved what we couldn't even theoretically approach, and they'd done it at industrial scale. One of the engineers, Miller Aerospace Division chief, interjected, but German jet fighters were superior. The Me-262 was faster than anything we had. One brilliant design, Klaus replied. Produced in small numbers, requiring rare materials, versus thousands of good enough aircraft produced systematically. We were playing chess, they were playing poker with unlimited chips. Different games. We lost before we understood the rules had changed. Dr. Chen pressed further and personally. How did you process it? How did you continue functioning after that realization? Klaus was quiet for a long moment. I compartmentalized, did my job, went through motions. But inside, something broke that afternoon in Manchuria. Not hope. Hope dies gradually. Certainty. The certainty that expertise mattered, that being correct mattered, that truth had power. I wrote the most honest, thorough, accurate assessment I was capable of producing. I documented the truth with precision, and it changed nothing. The war continued. People kept dying. The machinery of destruction kept functioning regardless of whether anyone understood its futility. That's the real lesson of the B-29 report. Not that America was strong, not that Germany was weak, but that truth is necessary and insufficient. You must speak it. You must document it. You must bear witness. But you cannot expect truth alone to change anything. Truth is what remains after everything else has failed. It's the record for future generations to understand what happened and why. The table fell silent. Outside, the Ohio summer evening faded into twilight. Somewhere jets were taking off from the runway, American jets, some incorporating design principles Klaus himself had contributed. Miller spoke quietly. You stayed. After the war, came to America, worked for us. Why? Klaus smiled without humor. Because the alternative was worse. I could return to Germany and spend my life rebuilding what we'd destroyed. Or I could stay in Argentina or Brazil like some colleagues and pretend the past never happened. Or I could come here and contribute to the future. The B-29 showed me that American aerospace engineering was superior. So I decided to be where the best work was happening, not loyalty, not ideology, just professional pragmatism. If you can't beat them, join them and try to be useful. And have you been useful? Dr. Chen asked. I have contributed. Whether that contribution justified the moral compromise of working for former enemies, that's judgment for others to make. I've designed aircraft, solved problems, trained younger engineers, tried to pass on not just technical knowledge but the lesson I learned in Manchuria, that truth matters even when it doesn't change outcomes, especially then. Klaus's home, Dayton, Ohio. September 1968. 4 years after the symposium, Klaus received a letter from Japan. The sender was a historian researching the B-29 campaign against Japanese cities. He'd obtained Klaus's name from declassified intelligence files and was writing to request an interview. Klaus agreed. The historian, Professor Tanaka, flew to Ohio. They met in Klaus's small house near Wright-Patterson. Tanaka was younger, perhaps 40. He'd been a child during the war. His father had been killed in a B-29 raid on Osaka in March 1945. I'm researching the aircraft that killed my father, Tanaka explained. Trying to understand it, not as weapon, but as historical force. Your report from 1944. I obtained a copy from Soviet archives. It's the most insightful analysis I've found. You understood what it meant before anyone else. Klaus prepared tea, American tea, not German. He'd adapted. What would you like to know? Klaus asked. Did you understand, in 1944, that the aircraft you were examining would be used to destroy entire cities? That it would kill hundreds of thousands of civilians? The question Klaus had been avoiding for 24 years. I understood it was designed for strategic bombing, which by 1944 meant area bombing. Cities, industrial centers, civilian populations. The euphemism was breaking enemy will to resist. The reality was mass killing. Did that affect your assessment? Tanaka asked. No, Klaus replied honestly. I was evaluating technical capabilities and strategic implications, not moral dimensions. Perhaps that's a failure. Perhaps I should have written, this aircraft represents not just military superiority but capacity for industrialized mass killing on unprecedented scale. But I didn't. I wrote about engine performance and payload capacity and operational range. Why? Because I'm an engineer. We solve technical problems. We optimize systems. We measure and calculate and report findings. The moral implications we tell ourselves, those are for others to decide. For politicians, military leaders, ethicists, we just provide the tools. Klaus paused, meeting Tanaka's eyes. That's a lie, of course, a comfortable lie that lets us sleep at night. But it's a lie. The engineer who designs the efficient killing machine is morally implicated in every death that machine causes. I understood that in Manchuria. I understood it more clearly when I came to America and saw the photographs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The B-29s that dropped those bombs. I'd examined one of their cousins. Had touched the same aluminum, studied the same systems. I'm sorry about your father, Klaus said quietly. I designed aircraft that killed people, not those specific aircraft, not that specific raid, but aircraft used for the same purposes. The moral distinction between which side I worked for is less significant than I'd like to believe. We were all participating in industrial-scale death. Tanaka nodded slowly. Thank you for honesty. Most engineers I've interviewed maintain the comfortable fiction that they're not responsible, that they just solve problems and others make decisions about how to use solutions. They're wrong, Klaus said, or I'm wrong. But I've concluded that pretending we're morally neutral is itself a moral choice, usually the wrong one. They talked for hours about engineering culture, about responsibility, about how nations industrialize killing and make it efficient and systematic. Before leaving, Tanaka asked one final question. If you could speak to the designers of the B-29, the American engineers who created it, what would you say? Klaus thought carefully. I would say you built something remarkable. An engineering triumph, a systematic integration of advanced technologies that changed warfare forever. You solved problems that seemed unsolvable. You achieved what seemed impossible. And then I would say you built a machine that killed hundreds of thousands of people, including Professor Tanaka's father, including children, including people who never chose war, never supported war, just happened to live in target cities. And then I would say both those statements are true. The engineering brilliance and the mass killing. You cannot claim credit for one while disclaiming responsibility for the other. The tool and its use cannot be separated when the tool was designed specifically for that use. And then I would say, I understand. Because I did the same thing we all did. That's the tragedy of engineering in wartime. We apply our best skills to humanity's worst impulses. And we tell ourselves we're just doing our jobs, just solving problems, just following orders. Until one day you touch an aircraft and understand that you're touching the physical embodiment of systematic death. And you realize you've been complicit all along. Final years 1970 to 1975. Klaus retired from active engineering in 1970, spent his remaining years writing memoirs that were never published, teaching occasional seminars, consulting on historical aerospace projects. He never returned to Germany, maintained minimal contact with his past. They built a quiet American life with a quiet American wife who understood that part of her husband remained in a hangar in Manchuria, frozen at 2:47 p.m. on an afternoon in July 1944. In 1974, the National Air and Space Museum contacted him. They were preparing an exhibition on World War II aviation and wanted to include his story. The engineer who examined the B-29 and understood what it meant, Klaus agreed on one condition, that the exhibition not glorify either side. Not frame it as triumph or defeat, but as transition point in human capability to organize destruction. The museum agreed. The exhibition included Klaus's original report classified now alongside photographs of bombed German cities and Japanese cities, technical specifications beside human costs. Klaus attended the opening, walked through the exhibition alone, stood before a B-29 engine not from the aircraft he'd examined, but the same model, and touched it once more. An older man, 78 years old, hand steadier now than it had been 3 decades earlier, but carrying the same knowledge. A museum visitor approached. Did you work on these? I examined one, Klaus replied, long ago, in another life. They're impressive machines, the visitor said. Yes, Klaus agreed. That's the problem. They're very impressive machines. Klaus Becker died in his sleep on March 17, 1975, heart failure. He was 79 years old. Among his effects, his wife found 73 notebooks, technical calculations, aircraft designs, and one notebook different from the others. Personal reflections. Started in 1944, continued sporadically for 30 years. The final entry, dated March 14, 1975, 3 days before his death, read, "I am dying as I lived, haunted by the memory of touching excellence and understanding defeat. The B-29 was 30 years ago, but I return to that moment constantly. Not because it changed history, it didn't. History was already determined, but because it changed me. I understood that being right is lonely, that truth is insufficient, that expertise without wisdom is just sophisticated ignorance. If I have wisdom to pass on, it's this. When you build systems of immense power and capability, you must never lose sight of what those systems do. Technical excellence does not absolve moral responsibility. Creating efficient machines for killing people is still creating machines for killing people. No matter how elegant the engineering, the B-29 was engineering triumph and humanitarian disaster, both true simultaneously. That paradox defined the 20th century. I fear it will define the 21st as well. We keep building better tools for worse purposes, and we keep calling it progress. I touched an aircraft and understood defeat. I spent 30 years hoping someone would learn from that understanding. I doubt anyone has. We're very good at learning technical lessons, very poor at learning moral ones. Perhaps the next generation will be wiser, or perhaps they'll touch their own version of the B-29, whatever form it takes, and understand their own version of defeat. And perhaps they too will document it carefully, report it honestly, and watch truth change nothing. That's my legacy. The engineer who told the truth and changed nothing, except himself. And perhaps, in small ways, a few people who heard his story. It will have to be enough. The notebook was donated to the National Air and Space Museum archives, where it remains today, occasionally read by historians, rarely read by engineers. Klaus Becker's gravestone in Woodland Cemetery, Dayton, Ohio, is simple. Klaus Becker, 1896 to 1975, engineer. He understood. No one who doesn't know the story understands what those two words mean. Those who know, understand completely. If Klaus Becker's story resonated with you, click that like button. Not for US, for the engineers who dared to speak truth when lies were safer. Every like pushes this story past shallow content and rewards depth over distraction. Hit subscribe because we're uncovering one forgotten chapter of history every week. Stories buried in classified files, engineers who changed everything but got no credit. Moments when one person's courage to see reality altered how we understand entire wars. Real history, no dramatization needed. Drop a comment telling us, have you ever had a moment where you understood an uncomfortable truth that no one wanted to hear? How did you handle it? Our community spans from Snow Polo to Sydney, from aerospace engineers to history students, from veterans to teenagers discovering these stories for the first time. Your perspective matters. Share this video with someone who values truth over comfort. Someone who understands that the most important engineering isn't just building things, it's having the integrity to report what those things actually mean. Klaus Becker touched an aircraft and understood defeat, then spent 30 years ensuring that moment wasn't forgotten. You're here because his story survived. Your engagement ensures it survives another generation. Thank you for watching, and thank you for proving that stories of quiet moral courage still matter in 2025. Men like Klaus Becker who chose accuracy over safety, truth over career, honesty over survival, they deserve more than silence. You're helping make sure they get it.